So let's start off with a thought experiment. I want you to imagine you're on this boat, fast asleep in the middle of the night, and you hear sirens going off. And it turns out the boat is going down, and you have to get off. And everybody gets off in the middle of the night, and you swim, and you're lucky enough to end up very close to this island. Everybody ends up on the beach, everybody's fine, just a bit wet and a bit shocked, but nobody's hurt. You then have to figure out how on earth to survive on this island until somebody comes past and rescues you. And everybody, starts doing a little bit to chip in. So some people go and get firewood. Some people go and, find plants that we can eat. Some people figure out a way to clean water and get it back to the camp. But over time, you realize that some people aren't pulling their weight. You're absolutely knackered from spending all day collecting firewood, but when you get back, there's some people that you can see have been sitting around all day and doing nothing. And over a discussion over the campfire one night, you start talking about the way that we need to make sure everybody's chipping in. And we need some kind of way of making sure that everybody's contributing to keeping this community on the island alive. So somebody says, what if we had some kind of token system where if you did something useful for the community, you get a token, and then when you want to get food or firewood or something back, you have to give in the token. And that would be a way of keeping track of what everybody's doing and that everybody's contributing. Somebody else says, well, I think we used to have something like that back when we lived on the mainland. Wasn't it those bits of paper that we used? And then somebody else chips in with, well, yeah, I think, wasn't it money? We were using money, weren't we, to keep track of what everybody was doing. And the thing is, in the rush to get off the boat, everybody left their wallet on the boat, so nobody has any money. So then you need a discussion about who is going to create the money, these tokens that you're going to use on the island to keep track of who is contributing to the community and who isn't. Groups of people come forward with 3 different ideas. And the first one is this. This group comes forward and says, look, let us create the money. We'll take responsibility for that. And we'll lend it out to whoever has the best idea for how to use it. Whoever's going to use it in the best way, we'll lend it to them. And then in return, they can just pay us some interest to cover our costs of doing all this. The second group says, we'll create money and we'll pay people when they do something for the community. And then the third group says, look, we'll create the money, but we're just going to divide it up equally between everybody. And then everybody starts off with something and they can then use it to buy things from the community. So the question is, which one of these would you go for? I just want you to take a couple of minutes with the person next to you to discuss this and figure out which of these 3 options you think would work best for society and for the community on your little island, and the reasons why. And then I'm going to ask a few people to say why they chose for it. So, discuss. So let's do a quick show of hands. Who went for option 1?
I want to make shed loads of money.
Option 2? Option 3? Oh, that's a clear winner tonight. Option 2 was the winner yesterday in Plymouth. So. None of the above. Well, we'll possibly come on to that at the end. Yeah.
And who's the we? Yeah.
Who's the we? Well, that's a really key question. Okay. So the reason why this is important, really, is because it sounds a bit of a cliche, but money is power. Well, if you have money in the first place, you have power over what people do, and if you have the power to create money, then you have even more power over what people do. The current system by which money is created gives a lot of power to a small number of companies, and I'm going to explain how this process works and why we should be concerned about it. We're going to start with the question of where does money come from in the current system? Who makes these? The Royal Mint. Okay. So the Royal Mint makes the coins. What about paper money? There's a clue on the side there.
Royal Mint.
So with paper money, it's the Bank of England. What happens if you make your own?
Put in prison.
Yeah, something like this. So the twist is that cash is just 3% of all the money that exists. This kind of physical money that you can touch is only 3% of all money. The question is, what is the other 97%? Well, firstly, it's just electronic numbers in computer systems. It's those numbers that you see when you check your bank balance. There's nothing more tangible to it. But the question is, who has responsibility for creating these numbers? And the thing that not many people are aware of is it's actually the banks. You know, the same banks that we deal with every day, the same banks that were implicated in the financial crisis, are able to create 97% of the money that we use. Now, normally when I tell people this for the first time, they look at me like I'm crazy. This is a paper from the Bank of England, which was released in March this year, where they explain how this process works. And they say commercial, so that's high street banks, create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. So those numbers in your bank account are bank deposits. When a bank makes a loan, for example, to someone taking out a mortgage to buy a house, it does not typically do so by giving them thousands of pounds worth of banknotes. Instead, it credits their bank account with a bank deposit the size of the mortgage. At that moment, new money is created. So every time somebody takes out a loan, the bank is actually creating new money through some very simple accounting. And it's not illegal, it's the way the system is currently designed. But it is the way that 97% of all our money is created right now. Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator for the Financial Times, he just described it like this. He said, the essence of the contemporary monetary system is the creation of money out of nothing by private banks' often foolish lending. And some people say you should remove the word often from that quote. The reason why this is really important is because of where the money goes, how the banks use the money that they create. I'll just show you how much they've created. And think about this. If you give banks the power to create money, but then you also give them all the incentives and bonuses and commissions to lend as much as they can, as happened in the run-up to 2007, then they're going to have an incentive to create too much. So this blue line here shows you how much money was created by the banking system. In 1970, it was 29 billion. The green line that you can now see is the amount of cash created by the government. So this pretty much tripled over the next 10 years. It increased nearly fivefold up to 1990, nearly doubled again up to 2000, and then this is what happened in the run-up to the financial crisis. So we went over the course of 40 years from having 30 billion in the economy to having 2,185 billion in the economy. And the economy has grown in that time, but it has not grown anything like that amount. So if we look at just the money that they created in the 10 years running up to the financial crisis, so up to about 2007, this is where it went. 51% of all the money that banks created in that time went straight into property and commercial property, mortgages for big office buildings. 31% went into the financial markets. Only 8% went into businesses outside the financial markets. So the common idea that everybody has that a bank is somewhere where you put your money and then they go and lend it to an entrepreneur who goes and starts a business and employs people, that's a really, really tiny part of what they do. It's less than a tenth of their lending these days. The remaining 8% went into credit cards and personal loans. So you can see like most of the money that they were creating was going either into the property market or into financial markets, and it wasn't actually going to businesses that were, creating value and employing people.
Ben, can I ask a question as you go? Why did that huge injection of money into the system not lead to inflation?
Because it went into the property market. So it did lead to inflation, but it was inflation in house prices.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what about the debt? Because if money is created when people take out loans, then for every pound that is being created, then there's also a pound of debt. Essentially, you can see it as though we're renting the money that we use from the banks that create it. What this means is if we want to get more money into the economy, we have to go further into debt. Now, this eventually led to the financial crisis. that we had just a few years ago. And in the aftermath of that crisis, we had David Cameron saying, he was about to say in a speech that we all need to pay off our credit cards for the sake of the nation. And one of his speechwriters stopped him before he said that, because he realized the economic implications of doing so. So think about this. If money is created when people take out loans, what happens when the loan is repaid? Disappears. Yeah. It's exactly the reverse process. You take out a loan and the bank creates new money. When that process is reversed, it disappears. I won't bore you with a lecture in accounting to show how it's done, but I can show you if anybody is interested afterwards. But this is all pretty simple. Again, the Bank of England, in their paper, they said just as taking out a loan creates money, the repayment of bank loans destroys money. Banks making loans and consumers repaying them are the most significant ways in which bank deposits are created and destroyed in the modern economy. So this is the way that most of our money is created. And then when we repay loans, money actually disappears from the economy. So as well as having this equation here, that in order to get more money into the economy, we have to go into more debt. We also have this equation that if we want to have less debt in the economy, well, then we have to have less money, because as we repay the debt, that money will disappear. So I gave a talk a few months ago at the Citizens Advice Period to a group of debt advisors who'd spent most of their career, and think about this, sitting in an office with what seems like an infinite queue of people with debt problems coming in, then providing some advice, these people leaving with an opportunity to get out of debt. What they didn't realize is that every one of those people that was paying down debt was inadvertently withdrawing money from the economy. So if they get further out of debt, then somebody else must go into debt. Otherwise, the amount of money in the economy will shrink, and then the economy tends to start shrinking as well. So in the aftermath of the crisis, the government had this kind of choice in terms of what they did to respond. And they said, well, if we get people to pay down their debts, then the economy will shrink. Therefore, what we need to do is we go for this. We need to get banks lending again. So this is pretty much all you heard from politicians for the years after the crisis. We've got to get banks lending again. And the reason for that is because banks create most of the money that our economy uses. Now, since about 2010, when we were set up, we were warning that this will be the likely response, and that this will raise the risk of a future financial crisis, just piling more debt onto the debt that people already have. And this is the former chairman of the Financial Services Authority, so the man who was responsible for regulating the banks from the point where the crisis started until mid-last year. This is what he's saying now. We got into this mess because of excessive creation of private credit and money. He's talking about the money created by the banks. We should be concerned if our only escape route implies building up a future excess. So even the guy who was responsible for regulating the banks is now warning that the government's economic strategy and reliance on just getting people to borrow more and more is going to lay the risk of the next crisis. Okay. So to sum up these sort of key points so far, banks create money when they make loans. This is how 97% of our money is actually created. They create too much money in the good times because they get overconfident and they'll lend to anybody who asks for a loan, as happened in the years up to 2007. They put the vast majority of it into property bubbles and financial markets, and that has a huge impact on house prices. Also means the financial markets do very well, but very little of this money gets to the real economy outside of the financial sector. And when we repay loans to banks, the money actually disappears. So if nobody else then goes out and borrows more to replace that money, then the amount of money in the economy shrinks. And what that means really is we're kind of dependent on banks. We have to rent the money that we use from them, and it's very, very difficult for us all to start paying down that debt without causing a recession. What happens is that they increase their lending a little bit because they feel more confident about the economy. And then that money, as it comes into property, pushes up prices. Then people think, well, now's a good time to buy because prices are going up. So they ask for more credit from the banks. The banks say, well, property prices are going up, we should be lending more into this market right now. And it becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop where it goes up and up and up. But the consequences are, I mean, you don't really, because this argument sometimes comes up that, actually people were choosing to borrow, so really we were in control of the system. But you no longer have the choice of buying an affordable house because there are no affordable houses. So we have to borrow, 6 or 7 times your income just to get a house, because that is the result of all this money flooding into that market and pushing up prices. Go ahead. Yeah.
So if the banks are creating money out of thin air as debt and that interest and putting it into the economy, and then they take the money back out and the interest, that would surely create a decrease in the money available by society, which would drive increased borrowing, because otherwise there'd be no money to circulate.
Well, exactly, yeah. If we start repaying debts, then money disappears.
So with the subprime mortgage crisis, when they lent below the prime price and the money wasn't repaid, that would actually have been good for the economy then.
I need to think about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, they say that, because all that money wasn't repaid, that was what created the crisis. Well, actually, my understanding is that if you don't repay the money, you keep the money in circulation. And
well, true. Yeah, the money.
Actually, with the subprime crisis was actually the other way around. And if, so that was what triggered. Why did we bail the banks out to the tune of $1 trillion in a Labour government when they didn't need any money to be bailed out, because all the money that they lent people was created out of thin air in the first place? What did they need that money for? And where did it come from?
We'll come back onto this at the end.
Created out of thin air by the banks. We borrowed it, so we're in debt, and then we gave it back to them and they did what with it? Invested in China, I think.
We'll come back onto
applying logic to the system.
As I go through these consequences, try and have a think about which of those have either affected your life up until now or are going to affect you over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. Because this, money affects pretty much every aspect of people's lives. One of the obvious consequences of this is if money has been created when people go into debt and take out loans, then we will end up with a significant amount of debt. Now, the financial crisis happened when the level of debt had just about peaked. So you would have thought that since then people would have paid that debt down, but because of the recession, it's been impossible for most people to do that. This only goes up to 2013. The level of personal debt is now back on the rise again. So we haven't actually paid down all of the debt that we ran up in the run-up to the crisis. 5,000 people are being made homeless every year. That's partly due to these ridiculous housing costs, also due to the amount of debt that they have. 3.9 million families, which is 1 in every 5 families, only has enough savings to last 1 month's mortgage or rent. So that's a really dangerous situation to be in. You only need one person in the family to lose their job, and suddenly you're in severe financial dire straits. The poorest 10% of households now owe 4 times their income. If you're in the poorest 10% of earners, and you've got enough basically just to live, you're never going to have the chance to pay off debt that is 4 years worth of your income. So that debt will be with you either until you die or until you default. So these are some of the sort of human consequences of the current debt-based system. Housing. So the common story about house prices is, well, there's too many people in the country and there's not enough houses. There's some truth in that. We haven't been building enough houses for what people actually need in over the last maybe 20 or 30 years. That's partly a result of councils selling off the houses they had and not rebuilding any new ones to replace them. But this is quite an interesting chart. This starts in 1990. This purple line in the middle is house prices. The green line at the bottom is the population in the UK. And then this red line, which is actually growing slightly faster than the green line, is the actual number of houses in the whole UK. That's actually been growing slightly faster than population. There's obviously been some changes in household sizes that has put pressure on house prices. But what really explains why house prices are where they are now is the blue line at the top, which I bet somebody can guess what this is. It's mortgage lending, yeah. Yeah, it's all of the loans that were made for mortgages, which, remember, pretty much every loan created by a bank is also creating new money in the process. Consequences of that, for a start, if you're a first-time buyer, you're now giving up more of your income than you ever have. If you're in London, if you're in the UK, it's close to a historical high. And again, it's rising again. In terms of affordability, if you're a first-time buyer, this shows you what percentage of your post-tax income, the money that lands in your bank account at the end of the month, will go on paying your mortgage if you're a first-time buyer. And it looks, it doesn't look that high historically compared to that. But the scary thing is, if you can see that dashed line at the bottom, that's interest rates. So it's already quite high relative to history when interest rates are at a 300-year low. So think what happens when those interest rates go up. A lot of the people that are buying houses right now, I suspect, will not be able to afford it when those rates go up. So we're building up, a problem and the foundations for another financial crisis. It has a huge effect on inequality. It's a bit abstract, but basically, if you think we need to keep the economy going, we need money to go around and to circulate, but all of that money has to be borrowed in the first place for it to exist. So we have to be paying interest on all of the money in existence. We're basically renting it from the banks. And what that means is there's a huge transfer of interest from the rest of the economy back to the banking sector. Some of that comes back to savers as interest on your savings. But a lot of it goes into the banks themselves. They either go into shareholders, to people working in the banks and senior management to pay for the buildings, bonuses. So this is quite a powerful distribution effect back to the financial sector, and it's one of the reasons why the financial sector is so wealthy relative to the rest of the economy. Basically, we looked at the household data survey from the Office of National Statistics, and what it means is basically the bottom 90% of the population end up paying more interest to the banks than they ever receive. Only the top 10% receive more interest on their savings than they ever pay on their debts. And what that results in is this continual transfer of wealth up to the top 10% of the population. So when you hear a lot of talk about inequality now, this is one of this debt-based creation of money is one of the factors that's driving that. And then one of the other big impacts on inequality is just house prices. If you get sort of a gift from your parents and you can get on the property ladder, you benefit from this artificial increase in house prices. Same if you've got a salary that's high enough to get on that. But if you don't, then you don't get into the property ladder. You end up paying off somebody else's mortgage. And by the time you retire, that can make a pretty significant difference in your financial wealth. So it's another way of widening that gap between the very wealthy and the less so. Has a really negative impact on democracy. You've got to remember that banks are creating most of our money. In the 5 years leading up to the financial crisis, the government spent a total of £2.1 trillion over those 5 years. But they had 650 MPs plus all of the media paying attention to what they were doing and saying, we're cutting here, we're spending there. And there was so much scrutiny on how the government spends that money. The banks created £2.9 trillion in that time through their lending. The banks just have about 80 board members between the big five. These board members, they're not accountable to Parliament, to society as a whole. They're really focused on the short-term profit and success of the bank. So we have people making decisions about the allocation of a huge amount of money, essentially behind closed doors without any kind of transparency. Impact on the environment, there's a few impacts here. Banks create our money, so they get to decide how to use it. Again, there's no real transparency over what banks invest in or the kind of things we want them to invest in. No transparency over how your savings are used. So you can't say to the bank what's happening to the money in my ISA. There's only really Triodos, which will actually be very transparent with you about where they put their money. And also this boom and bust cycle. Whenever there's a recession, the government will step in and say, well, all of these environmental protections that we've put in place, that's just red tape now. We can't really afford that in a recession. We're going to abolish these environmental protections because we need to focus more on economic growth right now. So all of the work that people do towards protecting the environment and thinking about the long term gets reversed whenever there's a recession, because governments revert to thinking in a very short-term way. And then there's an impact on taxes and public spending as well. So when the Bank of England creates paper money, it makes a profit on doing so because it doesn't cost £10 to print a £10 note. And that profit from creating paper money comes back to the Treasury. And it's quite a substantial amount of money. It was, in 2009, it was enough for the salary, like the average salary of about 120,000 nurses. So it's a significant amount of money. Because the government's only taking responsibility for creating cash, it's only getting the proceeds on creating cash, which is the gap below that green line there. What it's missing out on is everything between the green line and the blue line. So by allowing banks to create the electronic money that makes up 97% of all the money we use, they're basically handing the banks the profit on creating that money. It's a huge subsidy to the banks, but it's a significant loss to the government as well. And we estimate it's about potentially 60 billion a year that they're actually losing. So that obviously is 60 billion pounds of extra tax that we need to pay every year as well. One of the other impacts on the government is the impact that we're facing now, the cuts. And the reason for the cuts is essentially there was a financial crisis which led to a recession. The recession meant that the government was getting less tax income because people were earning less and spending less. That meant that their gap between what they were bringing in from tax and what they were spending was getting bigger. They also had to bail out the banks, so that was added to the bill. And what they've done then is they've cut public spending. So they've tried to close the gap by cutting the public spending. So this is another way in which the current system ends up costing the government more and then ends up costing us more. Mervyn King, who is was the governor of the Bank of England until last year, was giving a speech about this current banking system. And he essentially said this: of all the many ways of organising banking, the worst is the one we have today. And one of the reasons for that is because of the way that this system works, in that money is created by banks when they make loans. So just take a couple of minutes, again with the person next to you, to talk about which of those problems have affected you so far, and how have they affected you? Is there something that you never thought of before? And then maybe I'll just ask a few people to suggest something afterwards. So yeah, just have a chat. Does anybody want to say anything that came to mind about how it's affected either their life so far or is likely to affect you going forwards? No? Housing. Go ahead.
I mean, not so much us, but help to subsidize our children.
Yeah. I mean, Peter, I don't know if you want to...
There's two different answers, and I've seen this twice now, so we've discussed it a great deal. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm an old crumbler, as you can tell, and I'm doing extremely well of it. I've got no debt whatsoever, I've got a very large house, I have holidays, I've got a final pay pension scheme, I've done bloody well, I've just followed that wave. But my son cries into his beer, my son does. He's waiting me to die because he can't afford a house, he can't afford a mortgage. His wife is working full time as well. They got nursery fees and God knows what else. They can't afford to live. And the best thing he can do is shoot me. So there are two answers there. Some people have done bloody well, i.e. me and a few others similar. And the kids are going to pay for our bills. And that's not justice.
Not justice, not fair at all.
Just us.
Sorry, just from my own point of view, from my generation, I was basically the reality I'm living is that I do work very hard, sometimes 6 days a week, and get very little time with my family, so does my wife. I am in debt, I'm not going to own my own house. So like you said before, I'm probably going to take the debt that I have to my grave. What we were talking about on the way up here, generally is reform is what about my children? How far is this going to go? I can cope, I can manage. But for the generations that come after me, where is this headed?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a really good point, because there's still some economists and some commentators in the press who are saying, well, you know, housing is still kind of affordable, so there's still opportunity for house prices to rise. But there's a very clear limit, which is once you've paid the mortgage, you have to have enough money to buy fuel to get to work and to buy food to stay alive. And if you no longer have that, then you can no longer pay the mortgage. What happened in subprime America was, or one of the things that happened, was these people who had borrowed more than they could for the housing were just about scraping by, and then petrol prices suddenly went up. And it was a choice of either you pay for the fuel to get to work, or you pay the mortgage. If you pay the mortgage and you don't get to work, you lose your income anyway, so you're screwed. So they chose not to pay for the mortgage, and instead pay for the fuel to get to work. Now that was, it wasn't the thing that caused the whole crisis, but it was the first domino to tip. And you cannot keep inflating the price of housing relative to salaries indefinitely. It just can't go on. So either we have to just stick with the situation we have and just lump it, or we have to do something to change it. So has anybody been thinking this, like, how have I got this far without ever hearing this before? Is it the first time anybody's heard this about money being created? You're not alone. Like, most people don't understand this, and actually most members of Parliament don't understand this. We commissioned a survey back in August this year by a professional polling company, and they went to 100 MPs to ask them what they understood about money. 7 out of 10 of them said that only the government is allowed to create money, including the electronic money in their bank account. Yeah, the reality is 97% of money is not created by the government. There was only 1 in 10 of them that actually understood that money is created by banks when they make loans and destroyed by banks when loans are repaid. When we asked them that question, we said, true or false, is this correct? I think it was 12% said true, 67% said false, the others were like, I don't know. And I have a hunch even that the ones that said it was true, it was a,
it was a lie.
They had a 50-50 chance. So prior to last Thursday, the creation of money hasn't been discussed in Parliament for about 170 years. Last Thursday, we finally managed to get MPs to have a debate on this in Parliament. This is Steve Baker, who's a Conservative MP who instigated the debate. It wasn't a debate where they could vote on changing things, but it was the first kind of discussion they've had about this in Parliament for a long, long time. And I've got a little video.
If members of Parliament don't really understand how money is created, and I really believe that is the majority position, certainly based on discussions I have been having, how on earth can we be confident that the reforms we brought in over the course of the last few years are going to work, are going to prevent repeat collapse of the sort which we saw before the last election? And my view is that we can't be confident. I think these issues need to be explored, and I think it is time for a monetary commission to be established and for Parliament then to become much more engaged than we have been. This is a very small step in that direction.
Okay, so that was Zach Goldsmith, who's also a Conservative MP, admitting that most of the MPs he's spoken to don't understand how money is created, and saying, if we don't understand it, how can we possibly assess all of this regulation, all these reforms that are going through Parliament right now? Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we change it. What we're proposing is something that we're calling a sovereign money system. And this is, in the current system we have bank money. 97% of money is created by these banks. So yeah, this is the first step. Take the power to create money away from the banks, return it to a transparent, democratic, and accountable body. So from history, from the last few years, we know we shouldn't trust banks with the power to create money. Nobody is suggesting we should trust these guys. If you give the power to create money to politicians, they're very likely to, whenever there's an election coming up, to have a very strong temptation to create too much money, to win votes, to cut taxes, to do whatever is necessary to win the next election. So they have a huge conflict of interest. What what we need to do to stop that conflict of interest arising is this. We need to separate a decision over how much money should be created, and that should be a question of like how much money does the economy as a whole need, rather than the banking sector or one specific part of the economy, and what that money should be used for. And what we're suggesting is there would be a committee, either at the Bank of England or potentially a new committee set up, which would be responsible for looking at the whole economy and saying how much extra money needs to be added. That money would then be transferred to government, and the government would decide how to spend it in the same way that it decides how to spend all of the tax revenue that it gets from us. So in terms of how you get that money into the economy, firstly, one option is through government spending. One option is to just cut taxes, to use that money to cut taxes. Third option is to just divide the new money that is created up between everybody and give everybody an equal share. So these are similar to the options that I presented earlier. The first two are the one about paying people to do work for the community, or giving them a reduction on what they have to pay back. And then this one is about just dividing the money up between everybody and letting people spend that themselves. We would have stopped banks being able to create new money. So they're not creating any more money. So you need somebody to create that money in their place. And that would be this, probably the Bank of England, although we might want to think about setting up something new. Just maybe just take a minute or two, which one would you choose, why, and then I'll just ask a few people to say what they went for, which is their preferred option. So, go ahead. Let's just do a quick show of hands. Just do a quick show of hands. Who went for the first option? Who went for the second?
If you can have a decent democratic government.
And the third option? That's more popular. A mix of all three.
Keep talking about these Totnes.
Yeah. Just saying it seems more pragmatic because it's quite a big step to go towards a citizens' dividend. That hasn't really happened before, so that would be a completely new policy. Has anybody got any comments on why they chose what they did, or what they think would be the pros and cons? Go ahead.
I just thought initially a citizen's dividend would be very helpful to the poorest section in society, whereas tax cuts only benefits the people who actually pay tax, and there's quite a large percentage who don't. And the same with government spending, which would take quite a long time to work its way down into money.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The citizens' dividend could be a way of cancelling out some of the rise in inequality. Because if, by our calculations, you might find that they're creating about 60 billion a year on the current sort of trajectory. If that was going in, well, either between everybody or everybody on below a certain income, that's a good way of sort of rebalancing things a little bit. Obviously not the only thing you need to do. There's pros and cons of every option. If you just do the citizens' dividend, it's quite likely that a lot of that money will go on imports. Some of it will be used to pay down debts. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But if, for example, your aim as a government was to reduce unemployment, you'd probably want to go for government spending, because then you have the option of making sure it's all spent on employing people. So we calculate, for example, if you were to use quantitative easing involved the Bank of England creating 375 billion of new money and putting it into the financial markets. If they created just 10 billion and spent it on something like building sustainable houses, they would have had exactly the same effect on employment and on economic growth. So actually getting money into the real economy through government spending can be really effective. If they go and blow it on something like the Millennium Dome, then who knows? For anybody who's not been following this, there's a debate in economics and in environmental fields at the moment, arguing that instead of just focusing on endless economic growth, growing the economy at 3% every year, using more and more resources, working harder, we should be thinking about actually reversing that and going back to using less resources And it's a fairly clear argument, I think. I mean, it's a long way from governments taking it on board. The question then is, if you're wanting to shrink your economy, does it actually make more sense to take money out of the economy? And you could do that also through, well, in the current system, money is being withdrawn when debts are repaid. In this system, you could do it through taxing the money out. But there's a lot more discussion to be had about that. And at the moment, academic economists and ecologists don't quite agree on how to approach that and what needs to happen.
Why don't you cancel the debt?
Because if you cancel the debt, the banks go bankrupt because of the way the accounting works, and then we end up having to rescue them because the money they created is our money.
Why do they go bankrupt? They just create money out of thin air. What's the issue?
I can't answer that without explaining balance sheets to you, and that's really boring. So come to me afterwards, I'll show you some sort of accounting. So then the second thing you need to do is create money free of debt. If you remember, I showed you this choice that we have, this kind of catch-22 situation in the current system. More money and more debt, or less debt and less money. And that's because money is created when people go into debt. Changing to a sovereign money system where the Bank of England creates money, but then that money is spent into the economy rather than lent. What that allows you to do is change this so that you can have more money and less debt. As the Bank of England creates new money, that goes in through the government, either through a citizen's dividend or through government spending. It then goes into the real economy, and as people receive that through their salaries, they can use it to pay off some of the old debt. And over time, you can pay down the amount of household debt that we have significantly. It will take 10 or 15 years after making this change, but it's quite a powerful thing to do. You would still have banks. They would work exactly like people think they do now. They would take money from savers and lend it to borrowers, but they would completely lose the ability to create money in the process of lending. Incidentally, every other business in the financial sector does not have this kind of privilege of creating money. You have a pension fund, asset management firm, they all have to get the money from savers first before they can go and lend it and invest it. It's only these banks that are actually given this special power to create money. So then the third thing is you need to make sure that the money goes into the real economy rather than the financial sector or the property market. So as I showed you, the majority of money at the moment is going into housing and financial markets. And then a sliver of it is going into credit cards and personal loans. What we need to do is to get it to go into either non-financial businesses or the real economy. And you can do that potentially through lending to businesses that want to grow, but also mainly through getting money into people's pockets, whether it's through the salaries of government employees or whether it's just through a citizen's dividend. And that will boost the real economy. So just to compare these two options then, in the current system, money is created by banks. In a sovereign money system, money is only created by the Bank of England, and banks lose that privilege. In the current system, money is created with debt attached. It's only created when somebody goes into debt. In a sovereign money system, it's created without the debt, so that you can get more money into the economy without increasing debt. In the current system, most of the money is put straight into the property and financial markets. In the sovereign money system, you can make sure it goes into the real economy. And then in the current system, banks are either creating too much money, for example, running up to 2007, or too little after the crisis. So it's never quite right. In a sovereign money system, you can get it much closer to being right. When the economy is in recession, they can create more. When it's booming, they can slow things down a little bit. The final little bit, I just want to talk about whether it's possible to actually change this. We've been talking about this idea since 2010. It's now starting to break through into mainstream discussion. It was really just something on the internet back in the day. But now the main writer, this is Martin Wolf again, the main writer for the Financial Times, recently wrote one of his leading columns where he said we should strip private banks of their power to create money. And he actually talked about the book that myself and a colleague wrote. This is his conclusion. The proposal will bring huge advantages. It would be possible to increase the money supply without encouraging people to borrow to the hilt. It would end too big to fail in banking. It would also transfer seigniorage, which is the proceeds from creating money, to the public. And he wrote this in the Financial Times, which is read by banks and people working in finance all around the world. Then, as I mentioned, we had this debate last Thursday in Parliament, the first time in 170 years where MPs have actually got up and talked about how money is created and whether we should be changing the system. There was a spokesperson there from the Treasury, from the Coalition's Treasury team. Obviously, she said, paraphrase, but basically, don't worry, we've got it all under control.
Yeah.
So we've also been growing a campaign around the country. So there's about 20 groups around the country. There's a group in Devon. I think everybody's probably seen a list if you wanted to sign up on that, if you want to get involved in the local group. Just leave your email address on that. There's been about 180 different events. This is 181. We've got about 37,500 people on the Facebook group, 10,000 people on Twitter, and then the website. If I went a little bit too fast today, because remember it took me about 2 years to get my head around this, and I've just thrown it at you in 60 minutes. So if I went too fast, check out the website positivemoney.org. There's a load of videos on there. There's other talks that I've done, and you can sort of take your time. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details, those are on there as well. If you're not from the UK and you're going back to a different country, then we have movements in 20 different countries now that are kind of growing up and spilling out from what we started in the UK. If you want to learn more about the actual proposals, there's a paper that you can download from the website. There's also a book, and there might be some books at the back as well, the book that we wrote, Modernising Money. There's also a short video there if you really, that's just an animation. If you don't want to read anything or see something, that just takes 4 minutes. So really the key point here is this, if money is power, who should have the power to create money? Should we give the power to create money to the same banks that caused the financial crisis? And that is a debate that has been had in history and also had in the aftermath of the Great Depression of the 1930s, but it's been completely forgotten now. And now that we've just had this huge financial crisis, we're saying it's time really to talk about who should have that power to create money and whether we should be taking it away from the banks that have caused the crisis. So yeah, that's I would suggest getting involved if you can. So I said I would come back to you in the red hand. Yeah.
Wait, this is probably a really silly question, but how do the central banks fit into this?
So the Bank of England is a central bank. In the current system, I mean, their job in the current system really is to support the banks themselves and what they do, and to stop the banks going bust and to rescue them if they fail. Obviously, they haven't done any of those things particularly well in recent times. What we're saying is actually, in history, they've had this responsibility for creating money. But they have not updated that responsibility as money has become electronic. So they've said, well, just leave that to the banks. And we're saying, actually, rather than providing all this support and guarantees and safety nets for the banks, we should just remove their power to create money, bring that back to the central bank, and then essentially leave the banks to do what they want, but at their own risk. Yeah. Go ahead at the back.
The financial system as it is, would it be true to say that it is written as a trap to literally ruin the lives of every single person in the entire world, except for a few people that are making a massive profit and a few people that benefit from the payoffs that these guys need to make to keep the system going as it is?
I think you may be assuming a bit too much intelligent design behind the banking system. It's
I think I'm not an economist. Many economists would accept the diagnosis. And even the sort of Austrian school, Hayek and so on, would probably accept the diagnosis. They disagree with the cure. And they would say that the problem is that we haven't got a free enough market. If the AG didn't support the banks financially, if the governments didn't do that, if the banks went bankrupt, and were allowed to go bankrupt, they'd have to behave more sensibly. How would you react to that?
We don't have a choice. I mean, you don't have a choice these days to be paid in cash. Everybody really has to use banks to store their money, essentially. If RBS, for example, had been allowed to go bankrupt, then 10 million people would have had no access to money. I mean, they would have had to borrow friends or family. And if you have a system where there is money which is created by the Bank of England, which is completely risk-free, completely safe, and then everything else is people investing at their own risk through banks, then you can say, well, look, the banks took risks, people knew that they were going to be taking risk, therefore you should let these banks fail. In the current system, you can't do that because the banks are on the payment system, and we cannot let the rest of the economy function without a payment system. So that would work if they weren't also creating money, if they were just investment banks, essentially. Let me go over this slide right at the back there.
Is not the Bank of England a private entity, just like the Federal Reserve is?
So I was just talking about this to somebody just now. Bank of England was nationalised in 1948. As far as we can tell, it's entirely owned by the state, by Parliament. There is a company called the Bank of England Nominees, which some people see and then think that's a privatised entity. What that was really was a company that they set up to buy shares on behalf of the Queen, presumably so that tabloids can't run tips based on what the Queen's buying. But they closed it down last year, having never traded, so there's no, it doesn't really serve any purpose. So, I mean, it's essentially a government entity. Like, you can make it work more in the public interest. Go ahead.
Well, we not seriously underestimate the power that the commercial banks have. They're not just going to lie down like it's happened, are they? They're deeply entwined into our society.
Yeah, and they...
I don't believe it's a coincidence that we're not seeing this more on mainstream media.
Well, they're definitely... I mean, to be honest, I don't think they're even taking much of an interest in this discussion yet.
Huge amount of their revenue that's just going to be cut off this.
Well, it's a subsidy, and they'll fight to save all their subsidies. But there is... I mean, one of the things we're doing, we're not going head-to-head with the banks yet. What we're trying to do is get people to understand the issues and get people better informed. And there's a few reasons. I mean, banks will become less important in the future because of some changes in the industry. Things like peer-to-peer lending and things like technology firms coming in and taking away parts of their business. And yeah, there is, it's definitely a massive obstacle, but it's one that, with time, should be able to circumvent.
I mean, with such a large proportion of the money being designated by debt, all they would have to do to cause a crash and get people on their side is to stop lending.
Yeah, well, that's one reason why...
They've done it before in the Great Recession, haven't they?
Well, that's
political power in their favour.
Well, that's one of the reasons why the Bank of England should be creating money anyway, so that we're not so dependent on the money that the banks are creating. And they could do that even now. Yeah, go ahead.
But what happened in Iceland where the government didn't support the banks?
What the government did there was they supported the banks for anybody who was Icelandic, and they said we're not going to pay back foreign investors. But that wouldn't really have benefited us that much if we'd done that, because most of the people that would have lost money would be, people in this country with accounts at RBS.
Can you tell us more about peer-to-peer lending?
Yeah, so peer-to-peer lending is basically they're new firms that grew up a few years ago, and what they do is you put your money in, and that money is being lent directly to other people. It's generally split, so if you put in a certain amount, it'll be split between 100 people, so you're not facing the risk of just one person, defaulting. But because of the way they work, you're not really paying for the bank branch and for all the overheads and the bonuses, so you get more of the interest. And if you borrow from a peer-to-peer firm, the interest that you're paying, you pay a little fee when you take out the loan, which goes to, say, Zopa, which is the company that manages this. But the interest you pay is going directly to somebody else. So you're kind of cutting the banks out with their little cut there.
Is that what banks did originally?
Back in the day?
Yeah. What bank was?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wrote to Sarah Wallace and RMD about the debate on using Positive Money's letter, and I got a response, and I couldn't quite make out what she was saying. I couldn't. She was also like you saying it seems all right. So she said the information from HM Treasury says the sweeping reforms from government has already made both our financial services regulatory system and the structure of the banking system itself in recent years since the banking crisis to create stronger and safer banks that work in the best interests of their customers.
She doesn't understand.
The tools to see emerging risks, including in the housing market, alter capital ratios and make recommendations on low to low income ratios and loan to value ratios, and maintain the stability of the financial system. And on money creation, through the current system, though the current system allows banks to maintain only a fraction of deposits in cash reserves and lend out the remainder, they also remain obliged to redeem all deposits on demand. This system is fundamental to the availability of credit.
Well,
that's a cut and paste.
Well, every single Conservative MP sent exactly the same response. So it's obviously somebody in the Treasury who's written that. Obviously, they're going to say we've got it all under control. What they've basically done is they've produced a very complicated set of rules that's designed to stop the banks, messing it all up again. The problem with that is when they create so many pages of rules, those rules are full of loopholes, and all they do is they employ an army of lawyers looking for ways to get around it, to circumvent it, to make sure it doesn't restrict what they can do. And I'm not saying that pejoratively. I got that from one of the chief legal advisors for one of the big banks, and so basically it's the wrong approach, really. They're making it more complicated. They should be making it simpler, and the way you make it simpler is to take away their power to create money, and then let them do what they want with their own money that they're risking. Go ahead.
Yeah, you describe what you call the sovereign money system. Are there any countries that use this, and if so, does it work? I mean, where?
It's a good question. So there is no countries using this exactly as we're suggesting at the moment. Most countries have taken the UK model, and that's partly because of the British Empire. We set it up in every other country. And the problem is that most countries right now are suffering the same kind of issues, like rising household debt, financial instability, bad government finances. What we're saying is, clearly the current system isn't working. It's time to try something new. What has been done is we've seen that the Bank of England is able to create £375 billion of new money. It's just that they chose to put it into the financial markets rather than the real economy. And that's, we need a different approach to what they've done. Yeah. Some of the First World War was financed by printing money. Obviously, that's not my favourite use for newly created money.
Main use, though.
Sorry?
It's the main use.
Well, it has been historically. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with your plan of action. I just wondered if you have any idea how to really implement the first step, which is to take power, which is money, away from the system. Because if you go down to it, you just find one family, the Rothschild family, who created the central banks in 1913. And from there, you have the power that's the central point of power, and they've been establishing their power base for 100 years. And I just can't see a way where we as the public or the people can, in an amount of time, which is, let's say in a short amount of time, which would be necessary to save the future for our children, to take that power away from this really established system back to the people. Where would you start with taking the power back and giving it back to us? Because I think they're not going to give it freely. They have so much power and money and control, not going to just give it up straight away.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I was saying, the banks are, they're very powerful and they're very influential, and they're too close to government, especially in the UK, and the USA is even worse. The thing is, there are other changes that are taking place that will start to challenge their power just in a purely sort of business market sense. So, for example, peer-to-peer lending is growing and growing. The FCA, which is the new bank regulator, they're really keen now on allowing more competition into the market so that other companies can take away business from the banks. We feed into those sort of, consultations that they do to point out other ways that they could allow more competition. So there's changes in the industry that might make them less powerful. The other thing is the current system, as I was talking about, is not sustainable in the long term because of this this build-up in personal debt. So banking as a business model isn't sustainable, and that has to change as well. And I think it's a matter of time before people realise that what we're trying to do is just get as much awareness out there as possible, and hopefully we'll do it in time.
Where can we start locally? Are things like local currencies, like the Totnes pound, actually doing something good if they're still based on the normal pound, which is then based on the whole system?
Yeah, I mean they do some good, but on their own they're not enough to cancel out the damage that's done by the national system. So you really have to reform the national currency as well as doing things like local currencies. Like you could do things like moving your money away from the big banks. If you look at the Move Your Money website, they'll give you advice on where else you can move to. If you have debts as well, you can transfer those debts to, say, like a peer-to-peer lender, and then you're paying interest to somebody else rather than to the banks. And of course, I'm not qualified to give financial advice. So, okay, final question. Sorry, I'll just go on.
Where do you stand in regards to things like Sharia compliant finance? So there's laws in the Quran about you can't use money to create money, and it's forbidden to give interest. So there's I'm aware of there being various national banks of Islamic countries that have very strict Sharia compliant finance, and they're not allowed to loan with an interest on the loan. So you mentioned something. You mentioned that there's a very high interest bill that we collectively pay, but it wasn't clear to me whether you're saying we shouldn't have any interest or.
So I'm not saying we shouldn't have any interest, partly because that's just way too radical and nobody would listen. I'm actually on Friday. I'm speaking in London at a talk which is about Islamic finance. And there's an Islamic finance scholar there. But Islamic finance is actually quite similar to what a lot of people would think of as ethical finance. They won't invest in pornography and alcohol and gambling, in certain other industries that they won't invest in weapons, for example. And one of the things they also say is because in Islam interest is forbidden, actually as it is in Christianity and Judaism. At the room. I'm really not qualified to speak on this topic, but they're much more focused on things like profit share. So if you invest in a business in a Sharia compliant way, you take a share of the business, but you also take the downside as well as the upside. And there's, I wouldn't advocate it as the only, as necessarily what we need right now, but I think there's some interesting ideas behind sort of Sharia finance and things that need to be thought about a bit more. Okay, I'm going to take this as the last question because you...
Thanks, Ben. You used to, in years past, talk a lot about the problems with fractional reserve banking. You have not mentioned that at all in this talk. Has it disappeared?
Well, I mean, this is what I've explained is kind of a form of fractional reserve banking, but the story about fractional reserve banking, which is, a man walks into a bank with $100 and the bank keeps $10 and lends the other 90, and then that goes out into the economy and eventually comes back, and then they keep $9 of that and lend out 81. That's a complete myth. That, if it ever applied, it hasn't applied for maybe 100 years since everybody was using cash. So even though it's still taught in the textbooks, it's a completely wrong way of explaining the way the system works. And basically, if somebody comes in wanting to take out a loan, subject to certain sort of risk considerations, the bank is able to create the money for that loan. And that's a much better way of understanding, how the systems actually works than that whole story that we had. If anybody's interested in getting involved, if you signed up on the piece of paper that went round, there is a group in Devon who have organised this talk this evening, one in one in Plymouth yesterday, which you obviously can't go to, and also one in Exeter University tomorrow night, which you can if I went too quickly tonight. So yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.